Well, hello, my name is Jim Royal. I'm a huge Beatles and Elvis Presley fan and basically classic music in general, rock. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. And then at the end, if you can do a thumbs up, that's always most appreciated. Today I wanted to talk about Beatles solo albums. Specifically studio albums and or working albums. Albums that were presented as new material for the artist. What I wanted to do is stay away from live albums that had previously released material. I wanted to stay away from greatest hits packages, box sets, anthologies, things like that. Okay? And the question I wanted to ask you is how many of you listen to, and most importantly, how many are out there from the solo Beatles? From John Lennon by himself, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Okay? I'm coming up with the magic number of 81. As of this taping, August 27th, 2019. Alright, so let me tell you how I get that. And I'd appreciate your comments as to how many you have listened to all the way through and how many maybe you haven't. Maybe a percentage, or maybe I've listened to a lot of this Beatle but not as much his solo work. Okay, so let's start out with John Lennon. John Lennon, I'm coming up with 11 studio albums / working albums. His first 3 were with Yoko Ono, and they were very avant-garde, very experimental. In fact, they weren't, most of them, or parts of them, weren't even recorded in a proper studio. In fact, his first album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins, was actually recorded on his tape recording equipment in his home. Alright, so let's start out with John. His first album was Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. His second one was Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions, and then the Wedding album. And those 3 were with Yoko Ono. Then his first proper complete studio album was called Plastic Ono Band, then Imagine. And then he had a double album called Sometime in New York City. And this one featured Yoko Ono. It was more of a rock-oriented album, and it had Elephant's Memory as the backing band. Then after that, he had Mind Games, Walls and Bridges, and then he did a 50s rock covers album called Rock and Roll. And then there was 2 albums he worked on with Yoko. They were rock-oriented albums. He submitted material and she submitted her own material. And that was Double Fantasy and then Milk and Honey. And Milk and Honey was the one he was working on at the time of his death. It was released after he passed. Alright, I'm not going to count Men Love Avenue, which was an album that was released after he passed away. Half of the material on there was rock and roll sessions, that we had never heard properly. But the other half were alternate takes to Walls and Bridges. So that one I'm not counting. Alright, so we've got 11 right there. How many have I not listened to? I have not listened to his second album or his third album. That would be Life with the Lions and the Wedding album. The reason for that is I had heard Two Virgins as a teenager. It just wasn't my cup of tea. And I had read that basically those were similar in nature to it as far as the sound. I will listen to it eventually for a historical perspective. I would like to listen to them. Alright, let's go to George Harrison. George Harrison has 12 studio records. And he has 2 more than I'm going to count with a supergroup called the Traveling Wilburys. So that's going to equal 14. Alright? So the Traveling Wilburys were a supergroup from 1988 to 1990. It consisted of George Harrison, Jeff Lynne of ELO, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Roy Orbison. Alright, so his first album was a soundtrack called Wonderwall Music. That was the soundtrack to the movie of the same name. His second one was called Electronic Sound, and it was a space-age 60s instrumental album. Way far out there. His third one was a triple album called All Things Must Pass. I'm not going to count Concert for Bangladesh, the live album, because it consisted of previously released material. But his next studio album was Living in the Material World, then Dark Horse. Then after that, Extra Texture, Read All About It, 33 1/3, George Harrison, Somewhere in England, Gone Truppo, Cloud 9, and then Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, and then Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. There was no Volume 2. And then finally Brainwashed. Brainwashed came out a year after he passed. He was working on that album during the 90s and the early 2000s. Before he passed, he had asked his son Danny Harrison to finish it, along with Jeff Lynne of ELO, and they did. Alright, what have I not listened to of George Harrison? I have not listened to all the way through. I have not listened to 33 1/3. It was just not an album that crossed my path when I was a teenager buying his stuff. I should listen to it. I need to. I have heard Crackerjack Palace, which is a wonderful song, but I haven't heard the rest of the album. The other album that I feel really bad about, because I've been watching YouTube videos and they praise this album, and I've done a lot of reading on how great it is. It's called George Harrison, the self-titled album from '79. I've listened to about half the album. Shame on me. I know I need to. I will do a first spins on that eventually, my impressions on it. But I have listened to Love Comes to Everyone. I have listened to Here Comes the Moon, Not Guilty, and Blow Away. And those songs I really enjoy a lot. And I think maybe I didn't listen to it because maybe at the time it was a little too mellow for my taste. Alright, Paul McCartney. Wow, he's got a lot of material. I'm counting the material that he did with Wings. He has 25 proper studio albums. He also has 5 classical albums. And then he's got 7 other albums, which are just kind of miscellaneous things. So that comes up with 37. Alright. Let's start out from the beginning. The first one is called, the first one is called The Family Way. And it was soundtrack music to the movie of the same name. Then he had McCartney. Then he had Ram, which was an album he did with his wife Linda. And then the first Wings album was called Wildlife. Then after that, Red Rose Speedway, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, Wings at the Speed of Sound, and then there was an album called Thrillington which was released. Thrillington consisted of instrumental versions of Ram. I don't believe Paul is on there, but he does produce it, and it was credited to Percy Thrills Thrillington at the time of its release in '77. Then London Town came next, and then the last Wings album, Back to the Egg. Then there was McCartney 2, Tug of War, Pipes of Peace, and then a soundtrack called Give My Regards to Broad Street. Then Press to Play, and then there was an album known as the Russian album, which was recorded exclusively originally for the Russian market and released there. It was basically a collection of 50s rock covers. Then after that, Flowers in the Dirt, and then Paul had his first classical album, one of 5 that came out so far. This is called Paul McCartney's Liverpool Oratorio. Then after that, he had an album called Off the Ground. And then the first Fireman album, one of 3 so far, which was a collaboration with a producer named Youth. Otherwise, basically, Youth is known from the group The Killing Joke. And it was a very experimental album. I think that album was called Oceans, Strawberries, Ships, Forest. Then after that, he had Flaming Pie. And then he had his second classical album called Standing Stone. And then there was the second Fireman album called Rushes. And then he had Run Devil Run, which was basically a 50s covers album. It does feature 3 new songs from Paul that are similar in nature to that style, that 50s sound. And these are songs that he basically grew up with. After that, he had an album called Working Classical. And it consisted pretty much of previously released material from his catalog, but there are some new songs, so I am including that for that reason. Then he had an album called Liverpool Sound Collage, which was basically just different tapes and things. There was some, stuff from the Beatles and other things. It was very experimental, very avant-garde. And then he had Driving Rain. Then he had an album called Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. Then he had an album called Twin Freaks, and this was a very rare album. I believe it's only on vinyl. It was with a guy named Roy Kerr, a producer, and I believe it was what called like a mash-up album. It pretty much previously released material. I think the producer manipulated it more than anything, but there is something new on there. And then in 2006, he had his fourth classical album, and that one is a Latin title, Behold My Heart. And then after that, Memory Almost Full. And then he had the third Fireman album called, let's see, Electric Arguments. And I'm trying to do this, there's a lot of titles here to remember. Then he had an electronica orchestra album, his fifth one, called Ocean's Kingdom. And then there was an album called Kisses on the Bottom. And that is an album of primarily songs from the big band era, swing era, easy listening, Great American Songbook, standard stuff that Frank Sinatra would sing, Peggy Lee, people like that. And there are, I believe, 2 new songs on there, original compositions. And then after that, he had New, and then Egypt Station. All right, well, what have I not listened to of that, of his stuff? I have not listened to 4 of his 5 classical albums. I have listened to the Behold My Heart one, the Latin title. I have not listened to Thrillington. And I have, let's see, I think I have not listened to all of Rush's from the Firemen, and possibly most of the first album. So I have listened to the third Firemen album. So there's 2 Firemen albums I have to listen to, and then 4 classical albums, and then Thrillington. So that's from Paul. All right, well, now we're up to Ringo Starr. So like I said, there's 81. 81 is the magic number that I come up with of, you know, these solo albums, working studio albums from all 4 Beatles. And at this time, Ringo has 19, but he is working on number 20, and I had actually read that he's done with 20, and he may release it actually at the end of this year or in 2020. So let's start out with his. His first one was called Sentimental Journey. It was a big band, swing, easy listening standards album. The next one is called Buku's of Blues, which was a country record. Then there was Ringo, which basically finally reunited all 4 Beatles. And there's one song on there called I'm the Greatest, which has 3 of the 4 Beatles on the same recording. Then Goodnight Vienna. And then there was Ringo's Route to Groove. Then Ringo the Fourth. Then there was Bad Boy. Then there's Stop and Smell the Roses. And then there was an album that was not released here in the States called Old Wave. And then Time Takes Time, Vertical Man. And then there was I Want to Be Santa Claus, which was a Christmas album. And then Ringo Rama, Choose Love, Liverpool 8, Why Not, Ringo 2012, Postcards from Paradise, and Give More Love. Of those, I have not listened to 13 of his albums. I've listened to everything through Goodnight Vienna. I've listened to Stop and Smell the Roses all the way through, and Vertical Man. So that is my video. I hope you have enjoyed it. So we're at 81 right now, but you know, hopefully we'll be at 82 soon, and both hopefully Ringo and Paul will continue to bring us new studio and new working albums. So thank you very much for watching my video. You have a good day. Take care. Bye.